You let me know.
Okay.
Good evening. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight for the College of Architecture and Design lecture series. My name's Philip Plowright, and I'm the chair of the Department of Art and Design in the college. The lecture series is a really unique opportunity to invite prominent designers and thinkers into our college and ask them to share their work and their ideas. A lecture series is also an opportunity that we use to share our values with the world. So we bring people in that reflect things that we're interested in, where we'd like to go, things we'd like to discover. And we use these opportunities as a part of our discourse. So to allow us to build internally, but also to express ourselves externally. Tonight, we're very, very honored to have Dr. Ian Bogost with us, who is the Ivan Ireland College Distinguished Chair in Media Studies, Professor of Interacting Computing at Georgia Tech, where he also holds appointments in the School of Architecture and the College of Business. Bogost is the founding member of Persuasive Games, an independent game studio, and contributing editor at The Atlantic. What I'm particularly excited about tonight is the ability to present really truly interdisciplinary work that clearly shows the value and the need for challenging some of the historic disciplinary boundaries that we erect between programs. Ian's work spans social values, politics, business, the built environment, literature, and poetry, and it definitely skewers social cultural issues through critique, parody, and subtle rhetoric using play. And I'd very much like to thank him for joining us, and I'd like to welcome him to the College of Architecture and Design. Ian?
Thank you so much. Okay. The title of my talk today, what I want to talk to you about is play as design. And I'm going to try to hit on a number of notes and topics that should be of interest to the varied audiences in this really interesting group. And I empathize with that because I too wear many hats, and among those are the hats of the game designer and the critic. And for some time now, though, I've been interested in games as something more than just the thing that you think of when you think of games as an entertainment form, as a pastime, as a kind of media, and in particular, in this container concept of play, which is bigger than games, but very much related to it. Play as a tool with general applicability to almost any domain, and especially to design domains of all kinds. I've also been interested in connecting my work in philosophy with my work in design, and that's an effort that I worked on most recently in this book, Play Anything, and actually during the same time that I was working on this, the broader philosophical trend of sometimes called object-oriented ontology has been very widely adopted in art and design, and especially in architecture, and that's a happenstance that's both chuffed and concerned me alike. So I'd like to explore some of those connections with you today as well. I want to start though with a story that I tell in the book, and it's in fact the story that I begin the book with, and I think it works because it's so simple and it's so illustrative of the virtues and the oddities of play. It goes like this: many years ago, I was running an errand at a mall here in Atlanta where I live, and it was crowded. It was the weekend. It was back when we went to places like malls, and I just wanted to get out. I just wanted to be somewhere else, anywhere else. But I had my daughter with me. She was 4 years old or so at the time, and so I was kind of pulling her with me, and she clutched onto my hand as I steered us through these throngs of weekend shoppers. And I was moving too fast for her. You know, her small legs she was taking 2 steps to keep up, struggling to match my cadence. But something else was going on too, something almost like rhythmic. And when I looked down, kind of irritated, like what's taking you so long? When I looked down, I saw why. She was staring straight down at her shoes and timing her footfalls so that her steps fell within the boundaries of the square white ceramic tiles lining the floor. And those pulls and tugs that I perceived were her attempts to avoid violating the grout lines with her feet while I pulled her through the crowds. And you've probably done this or heard of it yourself. It's a kind of rediscovery in her case, without knowing that she was rediscovering of this children's game called Step on a Crack, Break Your Mother's Back, which actually started as a superstition of the early 20th century and then only later evolved into a game for sidewalks. But she made this invisible adaptation. She had her own little version of it that was really designerly in a way, because I was leading her by the hand. I was like in the driver's seat, and she didn't have to look where she was going. She could just be pulled along, and that limitation created this new freedom for her. She could focus on her feet rather than the human obstacles in front of her, and the result was this kind of delightful, vertiginous, pleasurable, challenging experience, almost like this little microscopic theme park ride in a way. It was certainly much more interesting to her than anything that was going on in my head. I was just trying to get some errands done. She made the most of this situation, this boring, mundane situation, while I totally failed to do so. And on first blush, this kind of designerly behavior reminds many people first of the advice given by one of the best known philosophers of games, Mary Poppins, who has this spoonful of sugar routine. The Victorian nanny opining on the ways that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. And I remember even as a kid just being extremely bothered by this, and I didn't know why. Something seemed deeply wrong with it, and digging into it and thinking about the context of play many years later, uh, I just noticed that all of the examples of Mary Poppins's supposed theory don't make much sense. Like one of them is a robin that sings a song while fashioning a nest, and there's a honeybee that enjoys a sip of nectar while buzzing from bud to bud. Like these are supposed to be the metaphors, or the examples that the song uses to make the case for itself. And I don't know, like are robins bored? Are bees? This is a little bit of a literal interpretation, but if you just like stop and think about it, it doesn't make sense. Worker bees, for example, where they store nectar in a pouch. It's called a crop, and they actually regurgitate it up upon returning to the hive, which is clearly not the kind of prim Victorian fun that Mary Poppins really means. And when I stopped to think about this, it became clear that this whole idea, this sort of spoonful of sugar philosophy, what it does is it presents play as something that is covering over a drudgery, as this supposed Robin song is meant to like hide the boredom of nest building. So the actual song sung in the actual musical is supposed to hide the boredom of cleanup, and like that kind of works in the movie or in the musical because it's all abstracted, and that moment only takes up as much time as the song does to sing. Uh, but people really do adopt this kind of philosophy that play is a thing that comes from people making the best of things or trying to add something to a circumstance that's broken or undesirable, rather than something different, something that lives within the things themselves rather than in our heads and in the creativity that we bring to them. And even these simple, stupid, accidental experiences like encountering the tiles on the floor at the shopping mall, they show. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in these kinds of boring experiences is that you don't have to look for anything special to discover that something else, something bigger, is really going on. That play isn't about escaping something in favor of some better idea of it, but of embracing the thing itself, even if it seems unembraceable, even if it seems repugnant. And meaning and pleasure, or what we sometimes call fun, which is something I talk about a lot in the book, another kind of misunderstood or ununderstood term, and we could talk about that later if you'd like. It comes from allowing things to be exactly what they are, not rejecting them, not adding on to them, not covering over them, but then participating actively in the process of using them, even when those things that you're using and participating with seem arbitrary, ridiculous, stupid, and maybe especially when they seem that way. The philosopher Bernard Sweets has this definition of play that goes, the play is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. You sometimes hear people call golf like a good walk ruined, um, which is really too bad, because it's like the whole experience of it is taking on something other than the walk, right? Making use of the natural environment that's been massively altered, of course, for the sake of the sport, in order to embrace the fact that those obstacles are unnecessary. Play for Sweets is something that's good enough on its own that you don't need to question, and in fact, something for which that on its ownness is precisely the point. And the moment that you sort of start sneering at it, it becomes something different. Uh, Sweets has this idea of a illusory attitude that one has to adopt in order to partake of play. And it kind of makes sense, because if you're going to go golfing or play tennis, or really almost anything whatsoever, especially games, they're so ridiculous on their surface that unless you adopt this attitude where you take for granted, or you sort of suspend your disbelief in the ridiculousness, then you can never embrace them. You can never get anything done. But it actually turns out that idea of play, it's not limited to games or to sports. And you can see this in the way that we talk about play in many domains. Like we talk about like a mechanism, a mechanical apparatus having play, like a steering assembly. Like this one has some play in it, a space through which the steering wheel can be turned before the shaft turns the pinion, uh, or like the play of light. You can talk about like the play of light and shadow across the surface, such as this one, or the play of the waves as currents and winds and other conditions causes them to dance on the water, or a play on words. That language is at play or has play in it, and just the fact that a single word or a phrase can have multiple meanings, that when you hear it or write it down, that those ambiguities allow new meaning to arise. Those are also kinds of play, and they're the same kind of play. Actually, it's not just that the word is being used in multiple contexts. It's the exact same thing. Uh, the game designers Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman have a really lovely summary of this idea, in which they call play free movement within a more rigid structure. And you'll notice like that this definition is completely domain agnostic. It's not about games, whether video or board. It's not about sports. It's not about children or adults. It's not about any particularity. It's a general notion that play isn't a process of engaging with a particular media form, nor is it even a process of extracting enjoyment or pleasure from something, which is one of the ways that we sometimes misconstrue play. But that it's the process of manipulating the structure of an object or a system. And one of the reasons why games and the players in games are like the best examples of this phenomenon is that they're the most willing to partake of it. The player doesn't seek to overcome the structure of the thing that faces them, but to subject themselves to it. So that individual who goes out on the golf course and just won't engage with it, like what a dumb sport, what a waste of space and water. Like valid criticisms maybe, but what they're doing is not moving beyond or above the game. They're just rejecting it. They're not partaking of it, or they're playing a different game. Whereas the player embraces it, or at least encircles themselves, inscribes themselves within it in order to see what it can do. So that also means that play isn't a free for all. It's not like sometimes people will oppose play to work, and they're thinking of children in particular, like children who are playing or kind of doing whatever they want. But that's not right. Like play isn't doing whatever you want. It's not the opposite of work at all. In fact, it's a different kind of work, and that work is the work of working something. Like you can work the the clay. A ceramicist can work the clay, or the woodworker, like the way that we use that word woodworker, like someone who's working the material. That's different from the work of like clocking in or showing up or what have you. Okay. Or here's like a different way of thinking about this, using terms that are much more familiar to designers than they are to ordinary folks. Think of play as the encounter between limitations and constraints. And what the thing does, the material structure of a thing, whatever that thing might be, what it does is it creates this space of possible interactions, and those interactions are internal to the object or apparatus, and they're also external to it. They're interactions with all of the other people or objects or actors or other things that might encounter it and change it. The wind on the golf course as much as the golf club, for example. So like when you play a guitar, which is the way that we talk about it in English, you play the guitar. You're not doing whatever you want. Like that would be a nonsensical way of talking about like playing the guitar. You're doing something extremely specific, something very particular, and you hold the fretted fingerboard in certain patterns while strumming the strings and others, and the result produces sounds. And if you're adept at it, then those sounds transform into music. And that like makes play a material property of things, not of people. This is one of the big shifts in my thinking that I want to share with you, that people are involved often. People are very frequently a part of the thing that's at play. But play itself is in things. It's not in your head. It's a name for the capacities of a system when those capacities are limited by constraints, as they always are. And that kind of means that like play applies to anything. Uh, automobile transmissions, as much as yarn, as much as language, as much as games and sports, and even gardens and dishwashers, and the relationships that you have with other people, and the relationships between objects in the built environment, and so on. So, because the general nature of play connects that concept to every object imaginable, this is the place where like that idea, that line of interest of mine and experience, where it glues itself to my interests in philosophy. And as I mentioned, for a while now, I've been running with this crew of philosophers who call their thinking object oriented ontology, or triple O. And the name it's not so important. It's really the idea behind this thinking, which is that at a metaphysical level, that individual entities are the fundamental material of being, which also involves a renewed commitment to non-human entities, to things beyond the human mind, or the human experience of them. And these thinkers also contend that the things that you or anyone or anything encounters don't get exhausted. They don't get used up by those relations with other things. There's always something more in them, because they have potential that can be carried out in different circumstances. And one of the positions sometimes construed as somewhat contrarian in this line of thinking is that existence is the same for everything that exists. And we sometimes call this flat ontology, which is actually a term that's borrowed from Manuel de Landa. But one definition that I've used to explain this concept of flat ontology is this one: that everything equally exists, but not everything exists equally. That existence itself, when something is, it is in the same way that everything else is. But of course, different things have different powers and different capacities and different impacts. Another element of this line of thinking is its suspicion or even opposition to relationism, and relationism is just a simplified name for the position that it's actually the relationships between entities, between things that are more real, or at least more important than the things themselves. So relationist thinkers tend to privilege like flows, shifts, change, flux, becoming, those sorts of ideas over stasis and stability, which are considered like dead or weighty notions. Like these philosophies of relation have been popular in design and art for many years. They've been extremely influential in philosophy. They've been particularly influential in architecture. Um, and even like kind of adopted as sort of interpretations of these philosophical traditions more than applications of their thinking in the built environment. Like the idea of the sort of curvilinear structure as something that's in flux or flowing, like is related in concept, if not in its kind of direct relationship to a line of text in a way of thinking. And like as the architects among us will recognize, parametricism, which is a relationist response to postmodernism, is probably the most influential of these ways of thinking about relation as a predominant notion inside of that discipline. And like most of these takes, the parametricists tend to think that they're on the right side of history, since like we're living in this time when complexity and dynamism are the way of the world, and in this post-Fordist global knowledge economy, and everything is shifting and changing all the time. And in particular, Patrick Schumacher has been parametricism's main theoretical proponent, but its influence has also spread in the tools themselves much more quietly. Like there's a ton of these parametric design tools, Grasshopper and so on, that use visual programming where you wire up elements to one another to facilitate design through these sort of connected alterations to core mathematical values. And these tools are not limited by any means to these design disciplines. They're popular in art. Tools like Blender do this, in game design, and Unreal. The Unreal Engine uses them, for example. And there's been these warnings that Schumacher and others have tried to sort of flag around these ideas that you shouldn't interpret parametricism as this master discourse, sort of unified kind of idea. Um, uh, but in particular, he's also gotten in trouble for advancing what look like these sort of like directly totalitarian positions on the built environment. And so like that, that's like an interesting flavoring to ponder. But as someone who works, outside, I'm not a practicing architect by any means. I'm mostly a a scholar and critic of media and technology. But my connection and the connection that I've encountered in my professional and extra professional life to architecture and urban planning, some of it comes from being a journalist who writes commissions on urbanism at the Atlantic. But another part of it comes through much more low to the ground, mundane work in local land use politics in Atlanta. Like, there's nothing more boring than land use politics, right? Which is one of the reasons why I think it's such a fascinating and fruitful place to look for play in design as an example of engagement with the built environment. And in particular, I spent a lot of my time over the last 10 years or so working in historic preservation, planning, zoning, and other things. And one thing I've noticed in doing this work is how useful it turned out to be to adopt play as a kind of first order approach to design, and also how that process of play might suggest a really productive ways to approach design problems. Uh, in any design discipline. And so, like, urban planning or architecture offer interesting paradigmatic examples, perhaps as a way of concretizing and making real these philosophical ideas, but not just as inspirations, where you sort of read something and then and then you go to put pen to paper and just kind of imagine it as an inspiration, but as sort of direct ideals. And like the just like abusively ordinary nature of these issues also helps quite a lot, because there's nothing spectacular about much of this work. Like preservation, for example, is much less a practice of restoring or preserving monuments and landmarks, which is what people tend to think of, than it is one of like essentially just managing the pedantic details of design and influence and politics in a district or a location that has had the blessing or curse of being set up to do a preservationist work. And like some of these matters are easier to see than others in terms of their general relationship to things rather than their specific nature. But I'll just pull a few examples. These are examples that anyone who's done any work in the built environment knows. But then when you engage with them kind of anew, looking at them differently, it's possible to see them with new meaning. So like take like setback, for example, the distance of a building or a set of buildings, set of structures from a right of way. And like if like let's say that you wanted to design a block instead of a building, and you had some set of tools like wired up in your parametricized design system. And like this is like a great example of something that seems extremely feasible. Like if you wanted to match average setback, which is a common way that zoning and other sorts of conditions try to regulate building, um, then you could do that with like a single figure or something like that. That it's just a matter of calculating a singular number. But when we start looking uh, at streetscapes and blocks and regions with the preservationist hat on, they're less atomic. And so one of the concepts that arises is that of the so-called area of influence, where certain structures have a visual influence on others based on what is visible from one particular point and another, and something that could be visually impacted by a particular change is supposed to be taken into account. And this like just turns out to be like really complicated, because what you can see in the physical world from where and how and when makes it much more difficult to make general or systematizable claims about them. It's like like think about the difference between a corner and an interior street, or if you have a streetscape on a curve that 50 meters of visibility might have far fewer structures than down the block. Those sorts of things. Um, and likewise, there's this other thing that comes up all the time in the work that I do, because people are always trying to build like giant structures, and others are like, well, like maybe this is too big. And like, why is that? And why people are concerned about it is a longer conversation. But one way that this sort of design process is supposed to be managed across multiple structures is through this idea of establishing and preserving a rhythm of perceived massing. And this is really hard because it almost can't be measured in any fashion, and it really shows where parametricism um, ceases to be useful. Something I'll get back to in just a minute. And in fact, I want to show you some examples from this area that I do a lot of work in Atlanta, called Druid Hills, which is has a different set of guidelines, and the Secretary of the Interior adopts for preservation. I'm kind of also picking it because we have this delightful and amazing set of Frederick Law Olmsted designed neighborhoods, and then we have all of these weirder, smaller scale, less regulated areas just abutting them, that don't get to participate in the designerly history, the sort of prestige history of their nearby influences. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but like just a few quick factors for context around a design problem that I want to try to show you as a concretization of this idea. So here's some text from a set of guidelines, of design guidelines, and like don't try to read it; it's too small. But there's a thing called a recommendation, and a recommendation has different juridical implications compared to a design guideline, let alone a law or something that's enshrined in code, like a condition of zoning. So like that's one thing that's at play, is this weird interpretive, juridical or rhetorical process. But what it calls for, if you kind of just set that aside for a minute, is the minimization of perceived scale of new infill residences for consistency of height in new construction, consistency of height with nearby structures, for no more than 2 floors viewed from the primary street frontage. And then there's a bunch of acknowledgments about like implications given the hilly topography of the area. So okay, so that's the context. So here's a plat, and it won't make much sense on the map here, but there it is, 1774 on that map. And this is so a kind of tear down rebuild, kind of thing that happens all the time everywhere in residential America. Boring, fought about, like people want to do duplexes or triplexes, others don't. All that sort of stuff is at play here. Mostly 1.5 story ranch, minimal traditional homes, very kind of normal America. So like just like look at this block here and ask like which one of these streets. Remember, if we go back here, we needed no more than 2 floors viewed from the primary street frontage. So which of these is the primary street frontage? Like, is a primary street frontage the street on which the address lives, where the front door is, or is it something else? Or like, what is a 2-story home, for that matter? How would that be interpreted in relation to its neighbors? And so, if you start like asking these sort of like irritating questions, then you start to find the design space. And these are questions that nobody tends to ask, especially in a context like this, right? Which isn't glory design, right? It's just ordinary, mundane, everyday design. So this is one of the actual designs for this single family home that got floated. And I picked this example for you because it's like so different from everything that we tend to consider in design education. This is like kind of horrific proposal for one of these like nouveau engorged faux prairie homes that have kind of been replacing the engorged faux craftsman homes in residential construction, at least in the area of the country where I live. And so I just invite you to think about that fact, right? That these are the kinds of structures that get proposed and built most of the time. And like when you're a working designer or architect, like this is the kind of thing that you do more often than not. So anyhow, this design was rejected based on the fact that it appears to have 3 full stories on the secondary street frontage. And so that makes an assumption about where the secondary street frontage is and what 3 stories is. And if you kind of like look at it, it does look like it's 3 stories high in a way. But like what part of the design makes it appear that way? Is it that like hip gabled outcropping at the top left? Is that it? Or is it the narrow run of casement windows that are above those double hung windows at center? Is it just the height added by exposing this garage below via retaining walls, which was, by the way, not a condition that was pre-existing on this site? Like, what is it? Is it all of it? And so, like, if you try to like answer, that question, you realize, well, I actually, you just like stop knowing anything about anything at all. Like, I don't know. Now I don't know what a floor is. There's different people that make different arguments about this, about what, 1 and 1.5 story homes like really are. But, you get in the weeds and you realize I have no idea. Another issue here is height, which I mentioned before. Like height and rhythm and topography are introducing other design problems, other objects into play, if you want to kind of harken back to that idea of play as a framework. So here's a streetscape view of a different design for this same site. And you look at it and you kind of go, like, imagine that you're sitting on some design board or something, or, you're checking off building permits, those kinds of contexts. You're just running through, like, I don't know, looks all right, I guess, maybe. Maybe you could bring that ridge down a foot or something, who knows? But in the context of the rest of the streets, which aren't shown on that previous streetscape, the pattern of mass and void here, it ascends the hill, and there's this like kind of emergent rhythm that results from these 1.5-story minimal traditional homes, which is one of the things that we were in. That's like what the design task is preserving that pattern, not the individual structure. So like, does that hypothetical elevation at left violate the pattern? Is that a problem? If it does, then how do you reconcile that with what is sort of legally allowed? Because a 2-story home is supposed to be limited, but a 1.5-story is not. And this kind of bungalow style thing would be normally construed as a 1.5-story home. Is it a problem that has this 12 and 12 slope? Does that change your opinion of what a 1.5-story home might be, and why? So like I use this example because it's so dumb, it's so mundane, it's exactly the kind of thing that happens every single day, and it's also like a great example of the limits of a way of thinking about design in a kind of purely tool driven or parametric way. Like, the site in question is so forgettable. It's not a monument or a landmark that's under the control of a singular vision. And so, there's just no way that anyone would bother doing complex modeling for a circumstance like this. And actually, that sort of idea really runs afoul of this dream that we tend to have in the design disciplines, especially in the design of the built environment, where we still kind of want this like friction-free Wittgensteinian ice world solution where like we can kind of figure out the answer in advance and then carry it out, and like a design as a plan. And there's some people out there who think that, well, if we just have enough like interoperable design tools, that eventually we can solve all the problem. You take, your shadow modeling tool and your mass modeling tool and your zoning compliance machine learning interpretation system, whatever, and you could almost like computationally achieve not just beautiful results, but just ones. And that's a nice idea, but if you look at the world, like even the most storied monumental design projects, they fail at this. Like the Gary Disney concert hall famously had to be buffed down so that residents nearby wouldn't be blinded by it. A similar thing happened with this building, the Museum Tower is what it was called, in downtown Dallas. It was melting works of art at the Nasher Sculpture Garden just below. You can see that view of it from the Sculpture Garden with a piece in the foreground. Like, these are like major architectural projects. They're not these sort of forgettable single family homes that I've been talking to you. And you could imagine, though, and I think this is kind of the norm of a way of thinking about solutions to problems in general, is a kind of computationalist ideal of embracing the idea that we just need more measurement, direct and indirect, and then we can fully know and understand. And you take satellite photos and Google Maps photos and use those as a way of establishing pattern if what we're interested in is streetscape design. Or if you wanted to measure perceived massing, maybe you could add like volumetric scanning. You could send up drones and do lidar, or just 3D camera oriented scanning. This is cheap and easy enough that in theory even local municipalities could hypothetically afford to deploy it. And that's like, those are interesting ideas because they very much might be tools that are worth carrying out, but they also kind of betray the fact that like, especially this last one, this example of like a way we'll just record the massing of structures, and then we can go back and look at them later. But that betrays the fact that like this idea, this weird concept of perceived massing, isn't actually a measure of how much structure you have, but of how the structure appears in certain contexts to various sorts of observers from various vantage points. Which is, like, this shot is different from one that you would see in a different part of the street. And like no matter what you think of this design aesthetically or even morally, like even if you just recast its foundation in some contrasting material, it would probably kind of like pull it down to the ground optically. It would situate it into its site a little better than the way it appears to be in this, in this rendering, which was like probably just like carried out, like 5 minutes before it needed to be shipped to the client by the designer. This was not necessarily thought through in that kind of way. And you can take this to any end you want. Like, we could use virtual reality though, and then we can see things in exactly that way, where we can look at them from different perspectives. Um, and that also might be the case. Like, that's a really interesting idea. But to know that you would want to look at this design problem through this particular technological lens, you'd already have had to identify the possibility space for solutions in advance, such that you know that you were kind of checking against it. So this is like cart horse problem that arises. So like bringing this back to the idea of play, there's not just play in individual elements like light and shadow casting or perceived mass, but even play in like the meta designerly question of which elements are relevant or even possible to consider in a particular design context. And the possibility space, that possibility space for most designs, even seemingly simple ones, or even ones that don't get like much attention at all, it's so enormous and so grotesquely messy that it doesn't really make any sense to treat it as a coherent, stable, deterministic a system at all. It's much better to think of it as this mangle of things in play, but each of which is composed of particular elements, right? That are the ones that you have control over or don't have control over as a designer. So, like getting back to the mall floor and the guitar and sweets as illusory attitude, these are all reminders to me that design and use is in part a process of respecting, of understanding and respecting that play is always at work, and it's always at work in particular and specific circumstances. And if we adopt that idea, it can change our attitude about design, and in fact, design can help change our attitude about play too in the process. So instead of seeing either one, either play or design, as activities, maybe it's better to see them as conditions that are brought about when people engage seriously and deliberately with particular objects in particular circumstances. But that's extremely challenging because often we'll just like look down our nose at most ordinary things and ordinary circumstances. Like nobody really cares about the streetscape of this forgettable city block like they would care about a Frank Gehry building. The shopping mall floor, just like the faux prairie residential home. There's like jokes, there are things that our default attitude is to ignore them or to just disdain them. Like what sort of madman would care that much about ceramic tile or even about the rhythm of massing and void? But I just would invite you to reflect on the fact that you could point that sneer at anything whatsoever. And what do you miss? What do you miss in the process while you're looking for the things worth doing? What are all of the opportunities left behind? So play, I think, offers this invitation to pay attention to those things, to anything whatsoever, in the hope of finding and bringing out those unique uses, values, meanings, and interchanges. And play and design, they're not really about pleasure or cleverness or achievement. They're about like seriously approaching and manipulating the system that you find before you. So as I've been like thinking and wondering about interpretations of these philosophical concepts that might liberate them, that might make them fungible, in a way. I've looked around at all of the different ways that they're being used, and there's this like fantastical hypothetical Mark Foster Gage kind of neo-Gothic skyscraper, which is supposed to be like this kind of object-oriented uh, finger wag almost at the Deleuzian metal and glass folds that are everywhere. And Tom Wiscombe has these studies of form that you see on the side too, as ways of interpreting and adopting this philosophical concept. But I think that, and I think those are interesting and delightful, but they're almost too big. That there's this opportunity with play to think of design as a way of understanding the specific relations between specific objects in specific circumstances, and that just opens the doors to so many possibilities that we haven't construed as designerly or as of worth or as worth our attention as designers. And that's the opportunity I present to you through this lens. So thanks so much for your attention. That's what I've prepared for today. I hope we have some time for conversation.
Thank you, Ian. That's fascinating. And we'll open it up. If there's any questions, you're welcome to either turn on your mic and ask, or type into the text box, and I'll regurgitate it for you. I did, and maybe I'll start. And it's really interesting. I wonder if I ask you to unpack maybe a little bit more your relationship to Triple O, which I've always found in my review of it is really a resurgence of the 1980s self-referentiality, whereas architecture and design is just simply looking for a philosophy that allows them to do whatever the hell they want.
That's right.
And then
That's right.
somehow connects
Yeah.
it to some pseudo-intellectual thing that
Absolutely
gives them some cultural status.
Yeah.
And then it's like, I just made some shit and look at this, isn't it cool?
Right. No, I appreciate
that's,
that.
I mean, that's one way of looking at it. I really do appreciate Levi Bryant's adaptation, I think, from Harmon's original work. The work that they were doing together, and the way that Bryant interprets it through his ontocartography, and some of the, I think in some ways it's a little bit, more grounded. But I'm actually really interested how that aspect of it allows you to frame a position. Because in the end, that's the use of it. I think a lot of times, because architects are so object oriented, they tend to miss some of the some aspects.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really great. I mean, I totally appreciate those comments, and I don't think they're said out loud enough, because there is this very real danger, I think, in design disciplines in general, maybe architecture in particular, where what you're looking for is a justification to fetishize a structure that you designed or want to design. Then there's a risk that object-oriented thinking, whether it's Triple O or something else, is just sort of buffing that pursuit of egoism, right? It might not be, but there is that risk. And at the same time, as someone, like, when this started happening and I found out, well, like, these architects are reading my stuff, and that's really flattering, but I'm like actually also quite worried, because the built environment is serious. This is like serious business, and I would like it to be functional and equitable, and and not simply to be kind of subjected to the late. And of course, I've been through this myself. I remember, when it's not like deconstruction. It's not like deconstructionism in architecture had much to do with Derrida ever. It was exactly what you're describing. It was this sort of riffing. And I think Deleuze's influence has been, and like, I'm also totally fine with that. Like, there's nothing wrong with taking any influence as an artist and internalizing it and saying, you know what, I've processed it, and now I'm expressing it in this particular way. That's fine. And certainly it's not my job as someone who wrote some stuff to police how it gets read and used. But it just did occur to me as I was watching all this going down that, well, what about all these objects that are out there and that we do engage with at a more microscopic level when we do design work? What of them, and especially what of the mundane stuff that not only is intriguing on its own, but also seems to be often extremely poorly designed, and where very little cultural, social attention is paid to them, but also where they bear very little capital for designers themselves. Like, no one wants to be the person who is like designed the airport toilets, but actually, like, that's like a super fascinating, deeply important design problem. And that's kind of what I would be more interested in seeing the Triple O tradition, in my view, right, apply to, is all of that stuff, as well as the imbrications, with politics, with social circumstances, with technology, and all the rest. So I don't know where that puts me, in relation to my friends and colleagues, or in relation to the kind of currents of designerly tradition or whatever. But it's just been really, really interesting being at this like hinge, between the intellectual world of architectural theory and of philosophy in general, and then going and like hanging out with like very much like working designers and architects, who are like probably never read this stuff and never will and aren't thinking about it in those terms. And to hold those two things in my hand at once and go, like what can we do? Not to like reconcile them exactly, but just what do I make of all of that?
Hmm. And it was super interesting too, is because it's very hard for us to say drop our framing ideology when we start looking at disciplines. And so when you're working in sort of land value and urban conditions, but you've got a background trained in comparative literature and you work in game
Right.
theory, that must open up dialogues that other people, just because of the way that frames the way you think, it completely changes the way you might approach some of those things.
I think that's right. I think part of it is that like as someone who is at risk of being a kind of bricoleur, like just someone like flitting between different domains and pretending that I know anything about any of them. I am very aware of my own ignorance, or at least I try to be. And so when I enter a space of any kind, an intellectual space or a real space, my first inclination is, okay, like what is going on? Like what do I need to know? And that doesn't. It's been my impression in almost everything that I've that I've encountered in every domain. Like those questions just don't get asked that often. Like people have their eye on a goal, or they're just trying to get through the day. It's an honest thing too. It's just like you're just trying to get through the day, and go home. And so like in the real world of like going to evening hearings to try to get like a zoning variance or something like this, like people just want to leave, including the folks who are doing the decision making. And so like being able to, as as someone who was trained to with hermeneutics, and as an interpreter of texts, when you have those materials to reference and can start asking what would be those kinds of like irritating seminar room questions about them, but if they can be done in a way that lead productively to discourse that's not just meant to be discourse to hear yourself think, but to really get to the bottom of the design question in order to get your way back out of it, then it's startling to people. I once got in this fight in about what made a sign, like a commercial sign, extant, because that was a text in a particular document or whatever. Like, what is an extant sign? Like, is it one that was always there? Is it the fact that there was a sign present? And it's like it's extremely irritating at first, but unless you do that work, then you're not really able to start asking questions about like, why is that there? Why did someone think that was an important criteria? Maybe you want to throw it away. Maybe it's just stupid, right? So yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's this sort of this combination of curiosity and incompetence that then causes me to become like almost perversely laser focused on trying to dig into things, which is also which is why games are so relevant to it. Because like a game does not need to exist. It's the one thing in the world that exists only to irritate you. It doesn't do anything on its own. You have to come to it and you have to interact and interface with it. Otherwise, it's just a lump of materials. And people do that anyway. And they spend like, hours, tens, hundreds, thousands of hours trying to figure out why this system that doesn't need to exist at all works in the way that it does, and trying to master it. And they do that because it's just interesting to do. So like that attitude as a way, like imagine if we had that attention and that capacity for attention anywhere else in our lives, in our private lives, in our social lives, in our political lives, in our lives with the design environment. That would be amazing. That would be just amazing. And so look, those are some of the connect. I realize it's like, it's like as a heuristic, I don't know that it works. I don't know that it functions, but I think it functions more than, I'm going to read some stuff and then do what I was going to do anyway.
So maybe I'll ask a question that is maybe less architectural, maybe even less designerly, but But first, I'd like to say thanks for the advocation of spaces that are maybe not normally designed, because I think you highlight the fact, like, we have entire generations of designers who are incredibly frustrated and disgruntled because they're not designing those high design things. And like 95% of the built environment is everything else that we're left with every day. And so it's really important. And I told you when we were talking earlier that I'm doing a seminar that has both game designers and architects in it. I was leveraging Play Anything in the context of the fact that, like, I talk about the difference between, say, Moore's law and Martek's law, that technology moves faster than people, and our students will constantly come up against the fact that they're going to have to learn new technology, right? What they're learning in school now is not what they're going to be using when they graduate. And so I liked your notion of play, and I wonder if you could talk about, have you considered, or are there people working on this idea that if we think about technology not with the anxiety that it typically produces, but to play, and maybe as someone that plays with Grasshopper for far too many hours in a week, right? That all of a sudden becomes a very, like, maybe it's a shift in, I have to learn this, or the computer doesn't work the way that I want. But your notion of play really opens up that discussion educationally.
Right. I really appreciate this question, because we think about this a lot. Grasshopper is a tool that can be used, more broadly. It's very widely used by architects. But there's, like I mentioned, Unreal or these game engines, same sort of thing. Unity. Like I have these students, these game design students, who they just become arrested by their assumptions about what they're supposed to be doing with the tool that they're supposed to be working in, and they'll like just pour hours and hours and hours of time into figuring out the problem that they have only because they're using the tool that they do. And then they go like download some plugin that's supposed to solve the problem written by like some dude in Latvia who hasn't maintained it for years. And then that only creates more problems. And, at some point you kind of go like, what am I doing? This is just like this bottomless pit of trying to manipulate the tools. So and the answer is just like, well, this is life. Like, this is it, and this is, but I think that sometimes, I don't know if this is a name that people use, but I sometimes call this sandboxing, this problem, sandboxing. And what happens is that when you start to learn something and it's new to you, then you're usually learning it in a context in which someone is really scaffolding you, like a class. And like, well, we're going to learn a little bit about Grasshopper, about Unity today. And then you're like, wow, this is amazing. This like opens my eyes to things that are possible. And then, and that comfort that you get partly from the actual pedagogical experience of learning how to do something, and partly from the sensation, the emotional sensation that you had of being scaffolded in that way, leads you to develop an attachment to it. And that detachment is very, very hard to break, even when you need to break it, or even when it doesn't do what you need to do, and you need to go find something else. So one way that to work around this, and I do this in my classes often, is like, we just need to use more tools. It's not so much that we need to just keep up with technological change, which is also really challenging. But if you just have this willingness and this ability to try new things, to see what they can do, to understand the differences between them, and what their potentials are, what their particular uses might be, then you become less attached. You become less sandboxed in that manner. And I think the hard thing about this is that there's still professional reasons why folks want to learn, the particular tools that they do, because in a particular moment, they are going just to do what they want, right? And so that becomes this teeter-totter, this sort of balancing act.
So from an educational perspective, I take it almost as like an omnivore aspect related to technology, right? That we should start to develop that much more, as opposed maybe even, and this is what's amazing to have this type of discussion tonight, is it an disciplinary agnostic type of approach, or like how we start to cultivate those types of relationships or types of things with the technology?
Yeah. So, and I think one way to do that is to just do anything. Like you want to go and learn how to throw pots. That's actually pretty useful. You're going to get something out of that. And it doesn't really matter if you're going to become, a professional, or even if it's going to become a hobby for you. And and like I think all of us this year have tried something new, whatever that might be. A bunch of people started making bread at home or whatever. It was a kind of big sourdough starter moment early in the pandemic. And, whatever that is, like that is a good example of like, you were constrained socially, physically, et cetera. And instead of kind of going, well, this sucks, there's nothing I can do, like, I'm just going to suffer. People realized, no, there's actually like much more meaning around me than I bothered to see before. And I can dig almost infinitely deep into it because like, your sort of thing that you're not looking at is someone else's whole universe, their whole career, everything that they know is bound up in it. So, it almost doesn't matter to me. It's a good way of framing it. It almost doesn't matter to me what else you try. It's just that professionally, like, yeah, maybe it would be quite useful to know a variety of different, or even to think of the architecture of those tools as being substantially, discrete from one another, instead of these sort of like universal suites of tool making, which we're seeing in product design, and architectural design, and game design. You're supposed to be able to do everything like inside of one place. Maybe that's not so great because then you get that sense of limited possibility as a result.
So maybe then just one more question, and then I'll stop. But I like your maybe equating what you just talked about. So I want to talk maybe education more broadly, but your notion of sandboxing, I think also in a lot of ways, like we've picked up the aspect from your book about like kind of drawing the circle.
Yeah.
Right. And like what happens in the circle. And so is there, like, if you were to change education, is that notion of sandboxing a positive thing, or is the longevity of that connection to a tool problematic? How would you kind of
one of the
that?
things that I do with my students, my undergraduate students who are studying like computational media, which, like, what does that even mean? It could mean anything. They in the intro class, when I teach it, I just throw a bunch of stuff at them, and I throw the dumbest stuff at them, like the least useful tools, things that not only would they not be able to use in a professional context, but that almost no one uses. Or no one uses anymore. It's like I make them make Atari games, which is an obsession of mine, or I make them program in this esoteric invented language called Chef, where the code looks like recipes, and then like it's like this. Can you like write a program and then go cook it? At the same time. And so, like at a pedagogical level, excuse me, at a pedagogical level, the reason for that exercise is I just don't want you to be comfortable. And so the moment you get comfortable, we're just like going to tear that rug out from under you and throw something else down. Sorry. And, I don't think that needs to last forever, but that's one technique. Because by the time that you settle into something, you want that memory of discomfort. And then you want to it's almost like, I don't know, like muscle, what do they call it? Like when you're working out and you're like muscle confusion or something, like the moment that you get into a groove, you need to switch it up in order to continue moving and growing. And so I think that's the spirit, that kind of pedagogically, that's the spirit of it. And it's, it's also the notion, it's why we do continuing education in professions that require it too. It's like, not just to keep up with what's new, but to just like open your mind to possibilities that you haven't previously considered. That would be the earnest way of thinking about it, rather than just like, well, what's the easiest, closest class to me that ticks off my licensure requirement or something like that. So, maybe what we need to do is like also turn up the volume. I think the lifelong learning part of this is really important, and turning up the volume on the value, and also the joy of that novelty is a way of taking those sorts of precious undergraduate style experiences and making them real on a long-term basis.
Yeah, which are also things that are incredibly hard to quantify, hard to define, I was just thinking about where I would put this intellectual discomfort on the accreditation matrix.
Right. Right.
Could you imagine how all of the schools would actually then line item that and require it in a course where, you know, I mean, it becomes an incredibly awful experience for everybody and doesn't do anything what you want it to do. So
I mean, I do think this has been one of the errors in taking design as a master, you know, discipline, or as a concept that exists as a bear word. You know, because now we talk about design, like not industrial design, you know, or urban design, but now there's design, right?
We could rant on that one for about an hour. I've got a very clear position on that one as well. And I'm absolutely frustrated because most of what I do is has to do with knowledge boundaries and territories and semantics, and design doesn't. It's not a discipline.
Right.
It's just not a discipline. It's a very large scale concept, and it's like saying art. Art is not a discipline. Because until we actually practice, until those things, you know, are physically manifest in the world, and they have very, very clear methodologies, procedures, applications, and those are the things, those tools are what defines disciplinary boundaries and knowledge. So it's super interesting. Yeah. I'm fascinated with your own work too, because you are moving into transdisciplinary areas where you just follow an interest, and that comes back to my original question, which you know, it's the benefit of being able to walk into, say, somewhere where there's lots of credentialing, but be able to see it in a way that nobody with those credentials can see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like a very privileged position, of course, you know, because like for whatever reason, I get to, like, why is it that someone like me gets to make observations like those rather than than someone else? And I'm just very aware of that, you know. But like, I think an easy way of thinking about this problem in a way that we can all kind of work on is that we're in a moment now where what we want are more perspectives in general, like more perspectives from different kinds of people, from different backgrounds, of course, but also more perspectives from people from different walks of life or with different professional interests or backgrounds as well. You know, it's all of it, and it's a process of like listening, not taking every piece of input as equal, of course, but trying to find ways of cutting through the murk and kind of synthesizing what matters in a particular circumstance and why.
Yeah. We're well over time, and we could probably stay here for quite a bit longer, but I want to just be respectful, and thank you again for joining us this evening.
Well, yeah, thanks so much. It's been great to be here, if virtually.
Yeah, we at some point we'll be able to actually travel again and visit.
Yeah, exactly.
And have the more casual conversations in ways that don't seem to end with a red button and a sudden shock of disappearing. So,
yeah, great.
Thank you, Ian.
Thanks again.
All right. Good evening, everybody.